Clients describe Ronald Recardo as a thought leader who brings 30 years of experience as an entrepreneur, management consultant, and corporate executive to help them solve their most challenging business issues. Ronald is also a noted author of 8 books and over 60 articles. Over his career, he has worked with over 100 different clients, such as Hasbro and Bilo to Capital Group and Shire. He is a recognized authority on topics ranging from leadership, growth, and performance improvement to HR and change management.
Good afternoon, everyone. I wanted to thank you for inviting me here today to speak. During my career, I've had the good fortune to work with over 100 different clients across a wide range of industries, from startup companies to the Fortune 10. Additionally, I've been an executive in 2 major companies. This presentation is really a summary of the work I've done throughout my career, as well as a survey that we had sponsored of 200 high-performing leaders. And what we were attempting to do was to understand the difference between those leaders that walked on water from those leaders that were average. And we've distilled 10 key attributes that separate the best leaders from everyone else. Number 1, the best leaders are great at being chess players. Number 2, these leaders use metrics to be able to focus efforts and reward the right things. Number 3, the best leaders really understand leadership does not really focus around being liked, but being impactful. Number 4, these leaders are able to think strategically, but have really, really good executional skills. Number 5, they understand their organization's performance drivers and what's the cause and effect. Number 6, they understand that too much collaboration really equals abrogation. Number 7, the best leaders really are good at attracting talent, retaining talent, not based on ancillary attributes, but based on very critical attributes. Number 8, they operate under the premise that A players only want to report to other A players. Number 9, they communicate clearly and periodically use sensing to be able to assess how effective they are at communications. And last, number 10, they hold people accountable. Let's talk about each attribute in a little bit more detail. You know, the best leaders are the ones that are really good at chess players. And you know, one of the most alarming things that we have learned over the years is that a disproportionate number of leaders have gotten into the corner office, not because of their strategic thinking skills, it's because they were really the best at fighting fires and dealing with crises. The best leaders are able to think strategically. They're able to play chess. They're able to think ahead, think at multiple levels, and get stuff done. Companies really need to learn a lesson from General Electric. You know what they've learned over the years is that leaders need different skills for companies that are in different business cycles. So for example, the leadership skills needed for a company in a startup mode, a high growth mode, a mature industry, or even a retrenchment mode are very, very different. So what they do is they purposefully rotate their leaders so they get a wider breadth of experience and then ultimately become better leaders that can address a myriad of business cycles. Peter Rengren is one of the people we interviewed during our survey. Peter's a former CEO and president of VMS, Video Monitoring Systems. It's a company owned by Burrell's. Peter said a lot of impactful things, but one of the things that he said that really made me pause, he believes that the secret sauce for his own success is saying, don't focus inordinately on cost reduction. When times are tough, double down, and that's the time to invest in growth. It's kind of like buying a stock. When a stock is down after a downturn, that's the best time to buy it, because why? It's only got one direction to go up. Attribute number 2, the best leaders are the ones that are able to use metrics effectively to focus efforts and to reward the right outcomes. You know, one of the best things that we can learn from companies is the work that Norton and Kaplan have done around the balanced scorecard. That's the tool that's become the industry standard. So think of yourself as being a pilot. And if you're trying to get from point A to point B, what you really want to do is you want to look at a variety of different instrumentation or gauges on your cockpit. You want to look at fuel consumption. You want to look at your altimeter. You want to look at if you have radar. You want to avoid difficult thunderstorms, right? And that will help you flawlessly to get from point A to point B. Well, most organizations have lots of different metrics. In some cases, too many. In some cases, they're measuring the wrong things. What a balanced scorecard allows you to do is to have 4 or 5 categories of measures. Those measures can be things like innovation. It could be market, customer, financial, operational performance. And what differs in a balanced scorecard is not only do you have outcome measures, very important, but you understand what are the things that drive those outcome measures, and then you have predictive measures around that. What it allows you to do is it allows you to predict the performance or forecast the performance of your company. And if performance doesn't, actual versus targeted performance are not aligned, it allows you to take and make critical changes in sufficient time so that you hit your numbers. Why do you want to do this? What's the learning? Many, many research studies have shown that companies that use a balanced scorecard significantly outperform those that don't. Let's segue to the next attribute. The best leaders understand that effective leadership does not equal being liked. Over the last several years, there's been a bit of a dumbing down of senior executives. I believe it's a function of the outgrowth of the 2007 economic meltdown, where you had a lot of the senior-most leaders cashed out or retired, and they were replaced by a younger group of leaders who were much, much more astute at survival skills. They realized that if they hunkered down, if they didn't make enemies, if they focused on more of a consensus model, the spotlight would be less likely to go on their head, and therefore they'd have a greater likelihood to survive. Another factor in promoting these behaviors is the inappropriate use of 360-degree performance appraisal systems. Wrongly, they've been applied in many instances where people who were really, really decisive made enemies. And when it came time for performance appraisals, they really got hammered on their performance appraisal. And that created a dilemma. They either changed their behaviors to get a better performance appraisal, or if they continued on the path that they were going on, they alienated the old guard so much that in some cases they were forced out of an organization. This is best summed up by Peter Wengren, again, from video monitoring systems. He said something to me in our interviews that stuck with me. He said, show me a leader who everybody likes, and I'll show you a leader who's made a career out of avoiding tough decisions. The most effective leaders are the ones that assemble a leadership team that's diverse, different styles, different socio-demographics. A leadership team where the culture is such that it's okay to challenge each other. And a leadership team where, the leader always owns 51% of the vote. And think about it, for many of us who've been in that corner office, that voice in our head is what got us into that corner office. If you're too consensus-oriented, the risk you run is when the music stops, you don't have a seat with your name on it because the organization went in a direction that it shouldn't go, you allowed it, and you paid the price for that mistake. Number 4, the best leaders are able to think strategically but have exceptional executional skills. The leaders of tomorrow, think about this, they're going to have to be able to think at multiple levels. They're going to have to look at data on customers, markets, competitors, and they're going to need to be able to distill that data and figure out how we win the game. The leaders of tomorrow need to be really facile at data analysis. They need to also not be steeped in old ways of doing things. They need to be thinking about, have the rules of the game changed? Does our business model need to change in accordance with the demands of the environment? This reminds me of a conversation I had a while ago. I was working with an executive who managed a portfolio of businesses, probably upwards of $60 billion worth of businesses, multiple operating units, operating companies that reported to this person. And we were asked to develop a strategic planning process for them. And one night over dinner, the executive asked me a rather innocuous question. He said, "So what do you think, Ronald?" And my response was, "Do you want the politically correct answer, or do you want what I really think?" And his response, like any good executive, was, look, I'm a big boy. I'm not a banana. I don't bruise. Give it to me straight. I said, I really think you're in trouble, and here's why. And I went on to say, I've worked with your organization for a fairly long period of time. There's some things that you're really not aware of. You're not really taking into consideration. Number one, Look at your business model. You have multiple operating companies. Each operating company has their own senior leadership team. So you have a lot more operating companies than your competitors. Therefore, you have more senior management teams. Therefore, you have more cost. Also, if you look at your business model, you have a sales force in each of the operating companies. In many instances, you have that same sales force calling on the same people. So in a sense, you're confusing people with messaging, and you have cost. You have multiple sales forces, whereas if you rationalize that sales force across the sector, or for that matter, across the entire company, you'd be able to have a tighter message, probably better sales, and certainly less costs. And lastly, look at your supply chain. Same. You're looking at it from an operating company level instead of looking at it at a sector level. And frankly, you should be looking at it across the organization. This results in slowness, distance from your market, and a lot of additional costs. About a year after our discussion, the senior executive that I was referring to was asked for his resignation because the performance of his unit had tanked. What's the root cause of that? The root cause really was the observations I made really weren't that profound. As a matter of fact, I believe anyone with an MBA and 5 years of experience should have come to the same conclusions I did. The leadership team was unable to disengage themselves from the rules of the game that had served them for so long. They were unable to look at what business model they had versus what business model they needed in the future, and ultimately they were not able to make necessary changes so the organization was able to perform as expected. Happens all the time in business. What's the learning here? If you really look at what a senior executive needs to do, it's really about growth. And two professors in INSEAD, Professor Mulbern and Professor Kim, wrote a book. And the book identified the concept of blue ocean, or some people call it white space. And what they concluded after studying for 15 years, the 30 different industries, they concluded what's the real areas of highest growth. And what they found was you don't want to really go head to head with companies around current markets, because what are you doing? You're competing with advertising, you're competing with promotion, and you're competing with price. So in order to get market share, you're reducing price in many instances, and then ultimately you reduce your own profitability. What you really want to do is look for uncontested market space where you can be first in, develop your tentacles and a foothold, and that's where the most profitable growth and the area where you can differentiate yourself, those are the areas you want to play. Let's segue to attribute number 5. The best leaders understand their organization's performance drivers. Think of the concept of cause and effect. All organizations have a certain number of outcome measures they're striving for. Could be improving customer satisfaction, increased market share, increased top-line performance, increased bottom-line profitability. Very few leadership teams have consensus around what causes what. Let me give you an example. Let's pick a pharmaceutical company. If you studied organizational performance, looked at their historical data, and you were looking at revenues, you might, over time, understand that there's a certain logic link. Maybe it starts with your sales force. X number of calls to doctors results in a percentage of sales calls. Those percentage of sales calls result in X number of closed sales, and then if you multiply that times your average sale, if you multiply A times B times C times D, that's your revenues. So often, the advantage of knowing performance drivers is if you're a CEO and it's in the middle of a quarter, it's February and you're in the first quarter, and you say, you know, we're not going to meet our revenue targets. What do you need to do? Make more phone calls to set up sales meetings with doctors, and that will fill up your pipeline of revenues. That's where some of the translation is lost. People do not understand cause and effect. It's like a black hole. It just happens. Or there's not consensus across the senior management team about what causes what. Once you understand your performance drivers, the next step is to put in some checks and balances in the system. One way to maintain internal equity is to look at the linkage between the internal performance and the performance of an aggregate business unit. Let's talk about how that could work. Let's just say you have a unit and you have 500 people, and 90% of those people are rated outstanding or above average. If there's a real tight linkage, that would suggest that the organization or the unit, their performance should be extraordinary. If there's not a correlation between aggregate performance of a unit and that of the individuals within that unit, something is broken. You have a misalignment. Often that's a function of you don't have in place the right measures, or sometimes it's a function of the leaders are really avoiding having tough discussions. Another action that can be taken is to create a process around calibration. Think about when you were in college. All of us had a professors where if you just showed up, you got an A. And I remember when I was freshman year, I took chemistry. Big class, 150 people in a room. And I took my midterm test and I got a 46. And I went to the professor and said, like most of us would, I think I need to drop this class. And his response to me is, what are you complaining about? Out of 125 people, you got the 5th highest grade in the entire class. What's the point here? The point is that leaders, like teachers, grade differently. There are certain leaders that are very, very lenient, and then there are certain leaders that grade very difficulty. The idea around calibration is you bring up the lower, easy graders to a higher level with the idea that you bring up the gene pool of your workforce. So calibration is absolutely critical to being able to bring up the lowest level of performance that's acceptable, and over time, your talent pool increases accordingly. Mike Alicia is an executive at Nielsen. He was another of the many people we interviewed. He had an interesting perspective that I'd like to share with each of you. He thought way too many leaders operate kind of under a football paradigm. They use a prevent defense. And for those of you that are not football aficionados, a prevent defense is designed to keep another team from scoring, but not necessarily designed to keep you or put you in a position to score yourself. Leaders have to avoid that kind of conundrum. And leaders need to engage people and make sure all of the HR practices are aligned, ranging from talent acquisition to performance management to compensation, all the way through rewards and recognition, so that you can get the outputs you want, the behaviors you want, and ultimately the organizational performance you want. Let's segue to attribute number 6. The best leaders understand that too much collaboration equals abrogation. You know, business is not a democracy, nor does it have to be a dictatorship. You know, too many leadership teams have opted for an overly consensus model, where it's almost just short of voting. And why is this? I believe it's a number of reasons. Number one, I think a lot of the reward systems have, frankly, rewarded the wrong behaviors. People are rewarded for keeping the spotlight off their head. People are rewarded for hunkering down. People are definitely rewarded for not making enemies. So because of that, conflict is avoided as opposed to surface. And there tends to be, let's play off the senior most person. You know, almost every company I work with says they have pay for performance. But do they really? You know, my observation is organizations are still carrying a heck of a lot of dead weight. And that dead weight becomes a blockage for others who are trying to progress up the hierarchy. And part of the reason there's so much dead weight is the way people are evaluated. You know, everyone says they do pay for performance. Well, let's kind of have a little bit of fun with this. You have two people. They're both making a base of $100,000. And the person who's an average performer gets a $2,000 raise, 2%. And a person who's walk on water gets a 4% or a $4,000 raise. Ask yourself the question, is a difference in $2,000 really going to be meaningful to drive the kinds of behaviors you want and to drive the organization to success? Most companies do not do pay for performance, even though they espouse it. Most companies are carrying way too much dead weight, and most companies do not differentiate performance between those who walk on water and those who are treading water. Let me quote Mike Alicia one more time. when we were interviewing him, he had said that Nielsen truly has a meritocracy that they utilize to reward people. People who are rated outstanding, on average, get 2.5 times the rewards of somebody who's average performer. And those individuals who are below average performers either get coached and counseled to find a role that better fits their interests and their skill sets, provided opportunities to enhance their competencies so they can perform better, or, quite honestly, are moved out of the organization. A companies, A industries like consulting, investment banking, private equity, they pay for performance. The best people make the most money and they're promoted and there's internal validity. More mature industries, companies that typically are farther back in the pack, if you look at the reason why they don't perform, to a great extent it's a function of the talent they have, the strength of the leadership they have, and the reward systems that don't hold people accountable, and there are no consequences for either great performance or for below average performance. So let's sum up this section. The leaders in the future have to be perceived as having integrity. They have to be transparent. They have to mean what they say and say what they mean. And they have to be dedicated to excellence, not accepting mediocrity. There's just too many cultures today that send out mixed signals. Attribute number 7. The best leaders attract, develop, and promote leaders based on impact, not on ancillary factors. Most organizations today have spent an inordinate amount of time and money on succession planning, talent management, and performance management. Almost all of them have defined what are the key positions, who are the ready now successors, and they've developed these intricate processes with 9-box models where you have a bunch of names in each box to identify who are the ready now successors. Here's where it breaks down 2 ways. One is you have the same ready now successors for a disproportionate number of the key jobs. That's the first breakdown. The second breakdown is you have no internal equity or no internal validity. What do I mean by that? People that are ultimately selected are perceived by entire workforce as being empty suits. So then the entire process of succession planning and talent management is really looked at an exercise in filling in the boxes and managing the administrivia around that. Another executive that we interviewed, Chenson Mills, she had an interesting perspective. What she said was, if you really want to focus on career laddering and development and progression, you really need to really focus on what are the potentials of the individuals, what have they done from a historical performance standpoint, not based on political relationship or convenience issues. Too many organizations today really are looking for the silver bullet. They're looking for that one bullet that will solve all of their development talent needs. And often you look at the senior management teams and they look exactly the same. Think about it. They're all ex-GE or they're all ex-Pepsi with the wrong perception that everybody in GE and Pepsi is a superstar. They're all 3rd-generation Ivy Leaguers. They have very, very similar socio-demographics. Or lastly, they're promoted based on relationship management. We call that the Friends of X syndrome. In summarizing this section, way too many leaders are promoted based on sizzle versus substance. What we have discovered is that the HR function really has to take the lead here. They have to make sure that all of their HR practices and policies and processes are aligned so that they can differentiate those who walk on water from those who are treading water, from those who are underwater and drowning. And the key here is making sure that these HR practices like talent acquisition, succession planning, performance management, leadership development, employee development are all tightly aligned and provide leaders with the right data to make decisions to be able to build the talent pipeline they need to be successful in the future. Attribute number 8. The best leaders operate under a simple premise. A players only want to report to other A players. A famous sports coach once said that it's all about talent. My leadership really only affects 10 to 20% of the games. And that probably correlates to the game of business. This reminds me of a discussion I had very early in my career, about 25 years ago, where I was interviewing a grizzled UTC executive, and he said something to me then that stays with me till today. He said, for every person I have on my team that doesn't hold their own weight, 10 other people know about it and don't respect me as a leader. Think about it. The number one reason why employees leave a company, it's generally not because of benefits. It's generally not because of pay. It's based on leadership and the culture of the organization. Does the culture fit with their values? Does the culture align with who they are and what they want to be? Remember, A players will not report to C players long term. If they're stuck in that scenario, what's their choice? They're either going to cut back performance because the environment really doesn't differentiate rewards, or the leader is not sophisticated enough to be able to determine, A from B, or the person's going to deselect and go to another organization. The net effect of that is your gene pool gets weaker. So ultimately you get an environment where the leaders aren't the best, they just stayed the longest. Number 9, the best leaders know how to use communications. They communicate clearly, and periodically they use sensing devices to evaluate the effectiveness of their communications. Think about it. What's really leadership? Leadership is about leverage. And leverage is really achieved through effective communications. So what do I mean by leverage? If you're a senior executive, you want to have cascading levels of commitment so that people understand where are we going, how do we win the war, and what are the rules of engagement. To do this, you have to have very, very targeted and effective communications. There are 4 key principles that we've learned around communications of effective leaders. Number 1, value. The communications have to be valuable to the people that you're targeting. What that implies is don't have mass communications. Target the message bites for each key group that you're trying to touch. The second variable are the communications timely? People have a day job. They're being stretched. They're working mega hours. You can't communicate information with the idea that it's going to be used 6 to 9 months out in the future. Communications have to be short message bites, and they have to be targeted and usable in a very short-term time frame. The third attribute is understandability. Let me give you an example. I'm blessed. I have a great wife. I've written a bunch of books and a bunch of articles, and my wife has always edited all of them. And often we'll have the discussion where she'll say, I know what you meant to say, but that's not what I understand. The same thing applies to business. Leaders are going to communicate, but they have to do so in manageable bites and make sure that what the intended message was ultimately received by the audience. And the last one's really the most important, believability. Did they believe what you said? Even with these 4 communication principles, it really comes down to ethics, integrity, transparency. Really, do you have a history, do you have a track record of meaning what you say, honoring your commitments, and do you have a track record of being equitable and fair? If you do that, you have currency in your back pocket. People will follow you during a crisis, and you can use that currency to move the organization, particularly during very difficult times where effective leadership is most needed. Let's try to summarize with the last attribute. The best leaders hold people accountable. That's the fundamental part of good leadership. Accountability starts with having the right measures in place. We've talked about the balanced scorecard. We've talked about having your HR practices aligned, performance management, compensation, recognition, rewards. These are fundamental things. But you really have to exercise your role and your right as sitting in the corner office. You need to hold people accountable. One way to do that is to make sure you have a process in place to, on a regular basis, evaluate individual and unit performance, targeted performance versus actual performance, understand where there are variances, and then, most importantly, have meaningful consequences. Hold people accountable. Have sanctions for poor performance and differentiated rewards for very meaningful performance. Okay, so let's talk about the net effect of this. If you're able to hold people accountable, what you're going to find over time is the lowest performers are going to transition out on their own. They're going to deselect. You're going to have a lot less dead weight you're going to carry. The net effect of that dead weight is there's going to be less blockages for other people. If you're carrying dead weight, it really creates blockages for your high performers to get where they want to go. And that's quite a dilemma. Why? Because it gives them two alternative thought processes. One is, do I go somewhere else where I have a better career path, which is one of the leading reasons why people leave? Or do I cut back my performance because, frankly, the rewards and the recognition aren't worth the effort? The things that separate an organization, and frankly, organizations from everyone else. One is the quality of leadership. Two is the gene pool and the talent of the workforce. And three is a culture that absolutely will not accept mediocrity. Before turning you loose to your next speaker, I want to thank you all for the opportunity you've afforded me to speak with you. I thought the survey and the work we've done was quite enlightening. In some cases, it confirmed what some of my underlying assumptions were with 30 years of corporate and also consulting experience. In other cases, I found it very, very enlightening to interview people, to understand really what it's like from their perspective to get things done in fairly large, complex, and in many cases matrixed organizations. And I really hope the content in this presentation was very useful for you, so when you get back to your offices on Monday, you're able to apply a lot of the concepts and learnings on your day-to-day activities. Thank you again for your time.